Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my spoiler-free review of Lightbringer by Claire Legrand. This is the third and final book in the Imperium trilogy, and this will not have spoilers for this book, but it will likely for the first two books, so if you have not read those books, I will leave my reviews for those linked on the screen. After the events of the second book, like immediately after, so we have Rielle's sort of descent into villainy from here. So in her timeline, she is sort of slowly continuing to unravel. She is with Corian, and they are sort of like going on their villain escapades, and we were watching that. And in Eliana's timeline, things are really messed up because she is also encountering Corian in her timeline and having to like fight against that in ways that she wasn't expecting. And we're also following Audric. Did we follow him in the second book, Kingsbane? I'm not remembering, it's been like years since I read it. But we are also following Audric and like what he is doing as like the hero in Rielle's timeline. So we are finally seeing if and when their paths will converge and in what ways, and like, will Rielle fully descend into villainy? Can she be stopped? Can the timelines be changed? Can the events that we saw in the first book at the very beginning be changed? All of that. So first off, I'll talk about the world building. The world building doesn't really change much in here. I don't really feel like we're learning too much that we don't already know, but we just continue to get expanded. What is the Imperium? Like, you know, we've sort of figured out that the Imperium is like more than just magical ability, but possibly has some like sentience to it, figuring out sort of more about how the events of Rielle's timeline are affecting like Eliana's and things like that. But everything that we know pretty much world building wise, we already knew before going into this book, so nothing new is really discovered here. We're just continuing to have some like, how are the political machinations working out? Who are the power players? Things like that. So I'd say it's much more like character and plot driven. As far as the characters, with this final book, I will say that between Eliana and Rielle, this very much felt like Rielle's story. The whole series really. Now looking back on it, it feels much more like, especially in the last book, Eliana got like a little bit overshadowed. I cared a lot less about her story. Now I've always kind of been a little bit more about Rielle anyway, even from book one, but I do say that I would like Eliana more in book two. So by book three, we're sort of I'm feeling like there's much more of a focus on Rielle and how are we stopping Rielle and can Rielle be stopped and is Rielle a villain and all of that. Also, the situations and things going on in Eliana's timeline with like her and the Simon betrayal and all of that, it is just, I cared a little bit less because I also from the beginning have not like super shipped her and Simon anyway. I've never liked the age gap with them. So as like a realistic romance where like Corian and Rielle having like a twisted situation, I'm kind of like, this is interesting, but I don't necessarily ship it. But with Eliana and Simon being the age gap that they have, I just never liked it. So like it's kind of hard for me to pull for that anyway, but I will say even with all of my personal biases aside, I do feel like her story sort of got overshadowed by Rielle's, but it also kind of makes sense because Rielle has always been set up as being like one of the most powerful beings ever, and I feel like they kind of shackled Eliana a bit. So Rielle for me continues to be the most interesting part of the story, and Corian, honestly. I do really enjoy their like villain dynamics together. I liked seeing Rielle's sort of descent into villainy because we do get to see a lot of that. There is this feeling of like, is this character going too far, which I think is hard to do and then maintain, like, is there redemption here? I don't know, like all of that kind of stuff going on. I will say that I do feel like people continue to love Rielle a little more than she sometimes, not deserves, but like, she does a lot of really shitty things to people and you're kind of like, why are you still giving her chances? Your boundaries are horrible. But even so, like, I still like dug her story, and even like Corian's like obsession with her in Eliana's timeline, like the toxic twistedness, like I like reading about it as an interesting dynamic, not as like, oh, I love them, you know, but just as like an interesting, compelling dynamic. I did find myself caring a little bit less about some of the side characters in here though, like maybe it was just the time that I took to read this series, but the side characters did start to kind of just feel a little bit more bland, and I feel like they just, again, everyone sort of lost their luster in the face of like Rielle's brilliance, I guess, and like just how big of a character she really is. Lastly, I'll talk about the plot. I do feel like this book was a little bit too long. This series in general is slower for like a YA fantasy series in my opinion. I like a lot of the tropes that it tends to explore, and continue to recommend the series for those reasons, but it's not exactly fast paced. It takes a lot of time meandering around. I mentioned that in my wrap up that I originally started this book in October of last year on audio and just like could not get into the audio, and it took me forever to read it, and then about halfway through I was like, I just need to switch to physical, and I did, and that was better for me, but it just reads really, really slowly. And I do think a lot of things could have been like edited down to make that problem a little bit less apparent. But I will say, as far as the wrap up and the conclusion of this series, I think it was done in the best way it could have been. There were a couple tweaks that I would have made, and I'm actually gonna talk about that in my discussion video that I'm gonna do for this book and this whole series as a whole. But overall, I think the way that this book went and the direction it took, it did the best that it could with sort of what it was given, and like what, like the two timelines and all of that. Like that's a lot to kind of unpack and kind of make flow, and I think it did that really well. So I continue to like Claire Legrand stories. Again, this is not a series that it's going to stand out necessarily for its characters outside of Riel and Corian for me, but I will continue to recommend just based on how many things it explores as far as like, you know, villains and different timelines and powers and what makes a person and what makes a person turn into a villain, like all of those dynamics. I think it does really, really well, but I don't feel like the characters necessarily stand out for me. But ultimately I gave this 3.5 to 4 stars, maybe, yeah, and I would say this is like a 4-star series overall for me. So like I mentioned, I'll be doing a spoilery discussion of this book and this whole series, so I'll link that on the screen for you to check out if you've read it. Comment below, let me know what you thought of Lightbringer. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.